Well, today we are continuing our series called The Dash. If you're just joining us, what we're doing is we're going through the Gospel of Mark with the express purpose of looking at a variety of the events of Jesus' life. Always coming back to the question of asking, who is this man? So that regardless of where we may fall in terms of the spectrum of faith or belief in him, it provides us with an opportunity to begin to explore and to understand just who Jesus is and the impact and the significance that he can play out in our lives as well. So one of the things we've been wanting to do is, as we have looked and focused on the events of Jesus' life, is not simply to gather more information. Absolutely, that hopefully is going to be happening from Sunday to Sunday, but we want to be able to ask the question, well, what does this mean in my life? How does this begin to play out in my day-by-day living? I heard a great kind of phrase this past week from a guy named Bruxy Cavey, and he says one of the challenges that we face oftentimes in churches is that we have what he would call our bobblehead believers. Everyone ever have a bobblehead? You go to a baseball game, you get a bobblehead, and the head just always kind of bobbles, right? And one of the problems we have is that if we simply become bobblehead believers, that we can stand here and we can read Scripture, we can hear people tell us about the Bible, and we can bobble back and forth, and say, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, yes, I agree. But then that's all we do. It doesn't actually begin to take root in our life. It doesn't actually begin to play out significantly in who we are and wanting to become. So every Sunday, that is our goal, not to produce bobblehead believers. But it means it's up to you and it's up to me that when we leave from this place, that we begin to ask some of the hard questions. To recognize that at times we're going to be pushed in certain places where we may not want to go, but believing that Jesus is wanting to teach us, wanting to show us something significant. And that's kind of where we ended up last week, was on the way in which Jesus teaches. And we focused and we realized, and if you read through the Gospels, if you read through Mark or the other three, you see that Jesus does the most teaching in ordinary places, in the midst of everyday life. Absolutely, Jesus will teach at times in the more formal places, such as the synagogue, what we would kind of refer to as the church here today. But Jesus so often would just simply meet people where they were at, with whatever they were doing, and begin to practically lay into their lives what it looks like to be one of his followers. And again, as we come to his passage this morning, another event of Jesus' life, we want to begin to ask ourselves, what does this play out in my life here today? So we're going to do it a little differently. It's perhaps a passage that is familiar to you. You've read it before. You've maybe studied it before. Or maybe it's completely new to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of segment this section of Scripture and just kind of tell the story and add some commentary along the line. So we get to the very end of it and then ask the question, okay, so what? What does this mean for you and for me living here right now? Because we have two choices. We can allow the words of Jesus to begin to conform in our lives, to transform us, or we can simply become bobblehead believers and say, yeah, I agree. That sounds good. And then go off and allow nothing that Jesus said or did to touch our lives. Let's start the story.
After Jesus crossed over by boat, a large crowd met him at the seaside. One of the meeting place leaders, named Jairus, came. When he saw Jesus, he fell to his knees, beside himself, as he begged, my dear daughter's at death's door. Come and lay hands on her so she will get well and live." Jesus went with him, the whole crowd tagging along, pushing and jostling him.
Mark is introducing the story to us. And Jesus has just come from one place and is now going to another place. And guess what happens? Jesus is interrupted. Not just simply with a theological question, but a man who is absolutely desperate. He is down to his last hope. His daughter is sick. More than that, she is dying. And he believes that unless he gets to Jesus, unless he gets Jesus to her and touch her, his daughter is going to die. What's interesting is that on one of the rare occasions, the name is given. So often we just read through the scriptures that a woman or a man or someone approached Jesus, but we're not actually told who it was. Historically, we believe that the writings of Mark are basically the teachings, the preaching of the Apostle Peter. So Peter must have had this just kind of cemented in his mind, just remembering how intense this man was, because we're told a few details about Jairus. Jairus was not just some ordinary, run-of-the-mill sort of guy. He was a synagogue ruler, which basically meant that he was someone of significant importance in that community. He had great social standing. He had incredible wealth at his disposal. He was someone who would know the Pharisees well and would probably hang in that circle, which is interesting because if you read anything about Jesus, you realize the one group of people that didn't really like him a whole lot were the Pharisees. And now someone from their group is coming to Jesus on his knees. You can see the desperation in his voice. He is desperate for Jesus to help. And so what does Jesus do? He goes with the man. He allows whatever else he was going to do to be interrupted to meet this man where he was at. The story continues.
A woman had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years. A long succession of physicians had treated her, and treated her badly, taking all of her money and leaving her worse off than before, had heard about Jesus. She slipped in from behind and touched his robe. She was thinking to herself, if I can put a finger on his robe, I can get well. The moment she did, the flow of blood dried up. She could feel the change and knew her plague was over and done with.
Clearly for Jairus in coming to Jesus, time was of the essence. His daughter was dying and he felt it so urgent that he couldn't even send someone else to bring the message. He had to go himself to bring this urgent message. Time was of the essence. Jesus, we got to get going right now. And then the story takes a little bit of a sidebar. We're told of another person, a woman, but no name is given. And we're told a little bit about this woman, that she was someone who has suffered physically from this continuous disorder of bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered physically. She had suffered financially. She had spent everything she had on doctors who were not seemingly helping her and almost making the situation even worse. She would have been out of luck socially and emotionally. She would have been kind of put to the fringe of society. So here we see this interesting dynamic at work where here we have Jairus, this well-respected man in the community, and this kind of nobody on the other side interacting and coming to Jesus with the same amount of desperation. This woman believed, she had heard stories about this Jesus, that if she could just get close enough to him, if she could just touch his garment, she would be healed. Jesus, like Jairus, was her absolute last hope. But as you read through the story, you almost wonder, why did Peter preach about this? Why did Mark include this? I mean, was it just some sort of interesting side note? I mean, was it just sign of, oh, by the way, I'm going to incorporate this? What's interesting is if you read the Gospel of John, another biography of Jesus, at the very end of his biography, John says, listen, Jesus did so many other incredible things that if we put down on paper everything else that Jesus did and everything else that Jesus said, there would not be enough books in the world to contain it. So what that tells me is that little things didn't just sort of slip into the Bible. Everything was intentional. Everything had a reason. So Mark must have had a reason for telling this story. I wonder what it was. Let's continue with the story.
At that same moment, Jesus felt energy discharging from him. He turned around the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said, "What are you talking about? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking who touched me? Dozens have touched you." But he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him, and gave him the whole story. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague."
The crowds were forming. There would have been so many people wanting to go with Jesus, wanting to see what was he going to do at the home of Jairus, this respected individual in the community. So clearly people would be pushing in, and this woman was so persistent that she would have had to work her way through the crowd. Have you ever been in a large crowd, whether it's some sort of parade or some sort of celebration or something of those sorts, and you're trying to get to the front of the crowd and everyone's kind of going along at the same pace, but you're determined and you're kind of snaking your way through. Well, this woman would have been snaking her way through the crowd, and finally she gets to Jesus, and she kind of reaches out and touches Jesus, and in that moment, she is healed. She feels something has happened to her body. She is healed. But in step, Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" I love the response of the disciples, because I probably would have responded the same way. "Jesus, are you serious? Who touched you?" The better question is, who isn't touching you? I mean, everyone's pushing you. Everyone's touching you. Everyone wants a piece of you. Jesus, what do you mean, who touched you? And Jesus is like, no, someone touched me. Somebody touched me. Who was it? And Jesus, when he wants to be, is persistent. He's like, I'm not going anywhere else. I want to know who touched me. And you can tell he's probably looking around, trying to check out to see who it was. This woman knows she is busted. She in some ways tried to shoplift Jesus' power, and now she's having to come and bear clean. She was afraid. She was trembling. I mean, a variety of reasons. One was she was a woman. One was she would be considered unclean by the religious authorities, and she just reached out and touched a rabbi, a no-no. Or maybe she wasn't concerned about that. Maybe she was concerned that she didn't actually come to Jesus and present her request, that Jesus was now going to take the healing away and say, nobody shoplifts from me, back to square one. She was afraid, she was trembling, so she comes to Jesus, and Mark adds a detail. She tells the whole truth, which for me means that she told the whole story. She got into the details. So imagine, Jesus is now having a conversation with this woman. I wonder if the disciples are thinking, Jesus, what are you doing? Remember the little girl, the house we're going to? She is about to die. Why are you talking to this woman? Imagine what Jairus must have been feeling. He's thinking, do I interrupt Jesus and just kind of give him a tap on the shoulder and say, Jesus, do you know what you're doing? I told you what the problem was and now you're delaying. Hurry along, let's get it going. Come on, what's going on? Imagine for a moment, you have a loved one who's about to go into the OR. The surgery has to happen right now. No time to delay. And you see the surgeon coming down the hallway and kind of pass you and say, okay, yeah, we're good to go. I'm heading in. We're on the way. And suddenly he bumps into someone and starts up a conversation. And you look to one of the nurses and you're like, well, who's he talking to? What's going on? He says, oh, that's just someone he healed, a couple months ago. Just chatting, just catching up on the morning's biz. And you're thinking, chit-chatting right now? Really? Seriously? To a former patient you've already healed? Move it along, man. I have my needs. I have my requests. Yet Jesus talks to the woman. He engages in conversation. Jesus won't be hurried. He won't be hurried. The disciples must be just standing there. Jairus must just be standing there. The crowd must just be standing there wondering, what is the deal with this guy? So the story continues.
While he was still talking, some people came from the leader's house and told him, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Jesus overheard what they were talking about and said to the leader, "Don't listen to them, just trust me."
Mark says, while they were still talking. It's not like Jesus kind of had a short little conversation and then kind of kept on going. he was still talking to this woman when the most devastating news that Jairus could possibly hear gets delivered. Your daughter's dead. Why bother Jesus anymore? What must Jairus be thinking? What must the crowd be thinking about Jesus? What must the disciples be wondering? Thinking, Jesus, why did you let this happen? Why didn't you just move along a little quicker? Didn't you understand what we needed from you? Didn't we understand that this was important to us? Didn't you understand that this is not how we wanted the story to end? But for some reason, Jesus wouldn't be hurried. Jesus wouldn't be scheduled into what they thought they wanted him to do. But it's in that moment that Jesus now directs his attention back to Jairus. He says, don't listen to what people are saying. Don't listen to them. Don't be afraid. Trust in me. Take a step back from the story. I'm sure we can begin to see ourselves in similar situations. Have you ever come to Jesus with such desperation that you have cried out to him? That maybe like this woman, you realize that Jesus is your only hope. Like this father, you realize that Jesus is the only one who can help you. So in desperation, you come to him with whatever the circumstance, whatever the situation may be, and you pray to him and you say, please, Jesus, do something. Change this circumstance. Make it all right. And not only is your prayer unanswered, it goes the way you feared the most. That's where Jairus is. He's probably in a place of disbelief. He's probably in a place of wondering, now what? Now where do I go? Now what do I do? And Jesus says to him, trust in me. This is where faith gets real. This is where the rubber meets the road in following Jesus. I mean, it's one thing to sing songs and to praise God when things are going well and things are going great and life is kind of rolling out as we had hoped it would. But when life takes that right turn, when life seems to plunge you off the face of the cliff, and it's in those moments that Jesus then says, trust in me. That's when it gets real. That's why we cannot afford to be bobblehead Christians that just simply sit there and nod our head and say, yes, we believe that God is faithful. Yes, we believe that God is in control. Yes, we believe God has a plan. Where the rubber meets the road is when the plans don't go according to plan, we are still able to step out and say, I will trust in you. I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand why it went this way, but I will trust in you. See, the story could end right here. The advice that Jairus is getting is don't bother Jesus anymore. You tried him, and it clearly didn't work. Isn't that often what people say when life doesn't go according to plan? Well, why do you have faith? Why do you trust in Jesus? I mean, look what's happening to your life. Why bother with him anymore? What would Jairus do? How would he respond? We go back to the story.
He permitted no one to go in with him except Peter, James, and John. They entered the leader's house and pushed their way through the gossips, looking for a story, and the neighbors bringing in casseroles. Jesus was abrupt. Why all this busybody grief and gossip? This child isn't dead. She's sleeping. Provoked to sarcasm, they told him he didn't know what he was talking about. But when he had sent them all out, he took the child's father and mother along with his companions and entered the child's room. He clasped the girl's hand and said, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." At that, she was up and walking around. The girl was 12 years of age. They, of course, were all beside themselves with joy. He gave them strict orders that no one was to know what had taken place in that room. Then he said, "Give her something to eat."
So Jesus continues to persevere. Jairus decides to take this huge step of faith, to trust in the one who everyone else has seen as having let him down. And he says, "Okay, Jesus, let's go. I have no strength left. I don't know what else to do, but let's go." And Jesus enters the home, and the morning has already begun. And Jesus looks around and says, the girl's not dead, she's just asleep. Well, now the morning turns to mocking, just sarcasm. Look at this teacher, this great rabbi. He doesn't even know when someone's living or when someone's dead. And Jesus just ignores him. And he walks into this girl's room, and he takes her by the hand. And he says, "Little girl, get up." There's a tenderness that Jesus uses, the same type of tenderness that a father would use to wake their daughter from a night's sleep. There's no hocus pocus, there's no abracadabra, there's no mumbo jumbo. Jesus just enters into this little girl's life. And she gets up. And she is more than healed, she is raised from the dead. At point blank, you can look at this story and say, well, there's another one of those happily ever after stories of the Scripture. Let's move on. I often think that one of our greatest advantages can also be one of our greatest disadvantages when we read the Bible. And it is this: we so often know how the story ends. That we can just simply enter into these stories and we can just breeze through them and think, okay, well, Jesus kind of took his time. He poked about a little bit over here, but we know how the story's going to end. We know that he's going to heal this girl. We know that all's going to go well. Well, it's fair for us to say because we weren't there living it in the moment like Jairus. Jairus didn't know how the story was going to end. He didn't even understand why the story was being written the way it was. I think the same is so true for us in our life. That when we step into the midst of the reality of life and we see the disappointment, we see the devastation, we sometimes see prayer being unanswered, we sometimes want to charge Jesus with malpractice because he is not responding how we think he should. How do we step out in faith? How do we then respond to this situation? You see, faith is so much more than just simply this cuddly emotion of just something we hold on to. It is the real life living of stepping into life in the midst of uncertainty as to what is happening, why it is happening, and saying, Jesus, I am still going to trust you. I am still barely clinging on. So what do we take away from this? What do we then learn from this so that we can begin to apply this into our own lives? Two lessons that have really struck me. The first is that when we come to Jesus, when we say, Jesus, I want to follow you, we will be asked to give more than we ever thought we could. Sometimes we think, we come to Jesus, we come to God, we're going to follow him. This is what I'm willing to give you. This is what I'm willing to offer you. Jairus came to Jesus and said, listen, I need you to heal my daughter. This is what I'm willing to do. Will you sort it out? And Jesus says, you think that's all you're going to give, but I'm going to ask you for something more. We read in the Bible that one of the fruit of the Spirit is that of patience. And so often I read that passage of this reality of patience in life. I don't know about you, but I often think about patience as being my patience with others, right? God wants me to show the Christ-likeness of me by being patient with people who bug me, by being patient with people who are late, by being patient with people who have different understandings, by being patient with other people. And the more patient I am with other people, then the more Christ-like I am becoming. And I think there's an aspect of that. But I often, if the greater aspect of that fruit of patience doesn't have to do as much with other people as it does with God. When God says, will you be patient with me? Will you be willing to trust in me? I'm sure I could sit down with all of you and hear your stories and hear how things have gone not according to plan. And we all want to ask the question of why. And my best answer is I don't know. Because so often one of the realities of faith in God is this mystery, is this understanding that we don't always know why God does the things that he does, why God allows the things that he does. And it becomes a mystery. But in the midst of the mystery, Jesus still says, trust in me. You see, Jesus, when we come and follow him, will always ask us to give more than we ever thought we could, because there's a reason. And the reason is because when we give more than we ever thought we could, we will get more than what we ever asked or imagined. This woman came to Jesus wanting a miracle, a significant miracle. She wanted to be healed. She could have just touched Jesus, and Jesus could have just let her touch her and be healed, and she could have gone away, but Jesus wanted to have a conversation with her. Why? He wanted to hear the whole story. He wanted to engage in her life so that he could say to her, you stepped out in faith, and your faith has made you well. The gift that Jesus wants to give us is the gift of faith. Not simply circumstantial living with him. Right? We know what that looks like. Circumstantial living is when we just come to him with different circumstances and one pops up and then we go back to living however we wanted to, and then another one pops up and we go back to however we're living. But when Jesus takes us beyond the point of where we think we can go, we get out of circumstantial faith and we get into the reality of living all of life with God. For Jairus, he came in a place of desperation, desperate for Jesus to heal his daughter. And then he delayed. He wouldn't be hurried. And you almost wonder, what is he doing? Jesus, I believe, was wanting to take Jairus to another place. Of saying, if you walk with me in the places where you do not feel you have the strength to go, I will give you this gift that is so worth having. It is this gift of knowing that no matter what happens in life, I will not give up on you. I will not let you go through it alone. How different would have Jairus' life has been if he just simply said at the end of it, I'm done, I'm out, I've tried, it didn't work for me anymore. Faith at its core is the ability to trust, to believe, to follow, even when we don't think we have the strength to go on, even when we may not even understand what God is up to. That's when we step into faith. I think a lot of the times we do ourselves a disservice when we put the focus of faith upon the strength of our faith. May I have the strength of faith. The importance of faith is not the strength of our faith, but the object of our faith. Tim Keller gives us this illustration. He says, imagine you are walking along a cliffside. You're walking along and you're minding your own business and all is going well, when suddenly you slip and you fall and you go over the cliff. And much to your pleasant surprise, you see a branch coming out of the rock face. Now, if you believe that that branch is going to hold you and sustain you, is that what saves you? Or is it the actual strength of the branch? You see, you can have the strongest faith in the world, but if you're only putting your faith in a twig that can be easily broken, it does you no good. But in the same way, you can have a doubting, you can have an uncertain faith, you can have a wondering faith, but if you reach out and grab hold of that branch and it's strong enough to hold you, you're saved. And what I do know is this: if you never reach out for that branch, you'll never know. And for me, that is the reality of life with God. We don't have to have perfect faith to live life with Him. We don't have to have all the answers. We can have doubts, we can have uncertainties, we can have disappointments, but faith is when we say, in spite of everything else, Jesus, I'm reaching out for you. I'm holding on to you because I believe you are in control. I believe you have a plan in the midst of it all. I believe you are the one who can give me hope even in places of despair. I know for us here this morning, we're all in a variety of places dealing with a variety of things. It seems so simple, but they are words that begin to change our lives when we don't simply hear them, but we live them. When in our places of greatest disappointment, Jesus says, trust in me. Trust in me. To know the impact that Jesus can have in our life, in our circumstances, and in our situation. It truly begins when, like Jairus, like that woman, like many others, we take that step of faith and we trust in Him. Please stand as we sing together.